Welcome everybody. We're on the second part of chapter 19 out of our Concepts of Biology OpenStax textbook. It's Community Ecology, section 19.4. So, community ecology. A community, scientifically, is all the organisms that live together in a place and interact with one another. So this includes members of different species, such as here on the African savanna, where we might have wildebeests, vultures, gazelles, lions, hyenas, etc. So community ecology makes up a branch of ecology, a study of the interactions among all populations in a common environment. And population ecologists like to look at what way do populations interact. So we'll be describing a lot of different types of interactions and different ways to measure communities. So a little starter here. Asian carp jump out of the water in response to electrofishing. And the Asian carp in the inset photograph were harvested in Little Calumet River in Illinois in May of 2010. Using rotone, not sure how to pronounce that, a toxin often used as an insecticide in an effort to learn more about the population of this species. As Asian carp, as their name will imply, are what are called an invasive species, and they don't belong in a river in Illinois. So we'll learn in this chapter how invasive species cause a lot of problems for communities. Take a moment and read up on our objectives for the chapter. And we'll start off with the introduction. Scientists study ecology at the community level, amongst other levels as well, such as the organism level or the biosphere level. Will go way up that way. But they can study it at the community level to understand how different species interact with each other and compete for the same resources. Because, well, populations of species do not live alone in isolation. There are other organisms that they will interact with. So ecological community consists of different species interacting in a given habitat. And one of the things that ecologists like to measure about communities is the diversity of the community, or the biodiversity. This is the number of species occupying the same habitat and their relative abundance. Areas with low diversity still contain a wide variety of living organisms, like the glaciers of Antarctica. You may not have known that since it's so cold there. You might not think there's a lot of things that live there, but there's still a wide variety of organisms there. And the diversity of tropical rainforests is so great, it can't hardly be accurately assessed. So one relationship is the predator-prey relationship. Classical example of a species interaction. This is where individuals of one population kill and consume individuals of another. And a very cool thing, they've been keeping data on the lynx and the snowshoe hare for a very long time, over 100 years. And so they've got to know very well this particular predator-prey relationship. And they found out that it's kind of like a 10-year cycle, that as the number of hares rises, over 10 years, the lynx numbers will follow, and then those hares will reach a carrying capacity and then kind of crash back down to a lower number, and then the lynx will follow soon after because there's less prey for them to eat. So here's a visual representation of that since before 1845. And so a lot of neat data to tell us a lot about this very special predator-prey relationship between these two organisms. And you can see where the lynx follows just slightly behind the hare. And you'll see that the lynx numbers never get up to where the hare numbers are, because you can't have that many predators in a community. The ecosystem just would not be able to support that. So you always have fewer predators and then more prey species. So predation can help drive evolution, as a follow-up to some of our previous chapters about evolution. The predators have adaptations to locate and subdue their prey, and then the prey have adaptations to elude and defend. And as time goes on, we see kind of what's called a coevolution happening, where let's say that the cougar's prey, the easy ones to get, become fewer and fewer. So then obviously then the cougars are going to have a harder time getting their prey, their meal, and the ones who can't, who are weaker, will die off. And then that's where we see a graph kind of like this, where the predator follows the prey population over time. So predation and predator avoidance are strong selective agents for evolution. Any heritable characteristic that allows an individual of a prey population to better evade its predators will be represented in greater numbers in later generations. The traits that allow a predator to more efficiently locate and capture its prey will lead to a greater number of offspring and an increase in the commonness of that trait in the population. And these relationships will lead to adaptations that are driven by reciprocal evolutionary responses in those populations. It's called coevolution. So what are some of these adaptations? They can be mechanical, chemical, physical, and behavioral. They're all utilized. For example, in mechanical, the presence of armor in animals or thorns on plants can help evade predators. Chemicals, like animals that can produce or obtain from somewhere a chemical defense from plants and then store them. Or an example of that would be plants producing toxins to discourage herbivory. How about in Minnesota, skunk using a chemical to shoo away a predator. The physical appearance, the body shape and coloration can help avoid detection, and behavioral adaptations like playing dead or traveling in groups are some examples of adaptations that are behavioral defenses that could evolve over time. And here's some examples in the pictures there. This bottom one, the foxglove, uses the chemical defense mechanism, and its chemicals can induce nausea, vomiting, hallucinations, convulsion, or death when consumed. That's pretty intense. An intense way to keep away predators. Or blending in, like the walking stick, and we have those, not the tropical one, but we have walking sticks in Minnesota that come in green and brown, and they are so hard to see. And the chameleon using its shape or coloration to blend in as well. More defense mechanisms to discourage attack include some colorations used as a warning to let predators know that, hey, I'm distasteful, I don't taste very good, or I'm poisonous, like the monarch butterfly and its caterpillar, obtaining poisons from its food, the milkweed plant. And also the coloration of the caterpillar is that yellow and black as a warning, and the butterfly is orange and black also as a warning. The fire-bellied toad, red and orange, let its predator know that it produces toxins to make them taste terrible. But this only works for predators if they use coloration, or if they use sight as a way to locate their prey, that they can actually see those colors. Such as a bird can see color and would hopefully heed those warnings. Plus learning, and often it's by trial and error that like a bird will capture a monarch butterfly and will attempt to eat it the first time and learn that, whoa, this does not taste good, and then will learn to avoid that insect from now on. So against prey, or against predators who can use sight and can actually learn. There's that fire-bellied toad right there, giving its warning signal. Don't eat me. I taste bad. Animals can also use mimicry. This is when a harmless species imitates the warning color of a harmful species. Like different insect species will do this, like mimicking coloration of wasps to discourage predation. There's some butterflies that mimic the monarch butterfly coloration, like the viceroy, to let others know, oh, please don't eat me. I'm trying to fool you with my color to make you think I taste bad when probably I really don't. But multiple species can also share the same warning coloration, and that commonness, if many share this coloration warning, the commonness can improve the compliance, the learning of those potential predators not to eat them. And this picture shows one form of mimicry with one insect mimicking the color of the wasp, the hoverfly. Or here, different butterflies with the mimicking of the coloration, like the monarch, the orange, yellow, and black, to say don't eat me. Again, that's mimicry. Some other anti-predator adaptations include hiding from predators to avoid detection and having really good camouflage. If you can see this lizard on the bark here, he's using that. Warning predators like the monarch here. And there's aposematic coloration. Apo means away. Somatic means a sign. So the sign for stay away, which include Batesian mimicry and Mullerian mimicry. So camouflage with cryptic coloration. There's the whippoorwill blending in very nicely. A frog here, the lizard there, a toad and another lizard in the pictures. This is cryptic coloration. And here's that Batesian mimicry with hawk moth larva. Looks just like the head of a snake, doesn't it? But it's just a larva. But that would be good at fooling predators into thinking it's a harmful snake. And here's the actual green parrot snake. Don't they look just like twins almost? Here's an example of a blue jay learning by eating a butterfly and then spitting it out, because man, does this not taste good. That's Batesian mimicry, when an organism looks like or mimics the look of the monarch butterfly. Mullerian mimicry, where two or more protected species look like each other to reinforce that, to let everybody know that this coloration means don't eat me. Like the school buses down here. To reinforce we are school buses. They're very similar but look a little bit different. There's some aposematic species that come to resemble each other. Black, red, orange, and yellow means don't eat me. Do you recognize any species on here? Like the monarch. I at least recognize that one. Or how about these snakes? So the coral snake is actually poisonous. They have a saying, it's red on yellow, poison fellow. There's the red on the yellow. And red on black, safe from attack. So the king snake is mimicking the coral snake. Not perfectly, so those of us with a brain will know, oh, the king snake is the red on black, it's okay. In community ecology, we often define a species niche. They also use the word niche. I usually say niche. That's the unique set of resources used by a species which includes its interactions with other species. And an organism's niche is its ecological role. It's like your role in your habitat. A habitat is like an address, and your niche is like your job within that habitat. So what they have found is the competitive exclusion principle, that resources are often limited in a habitat and multiple species may compete to try to obtain them, but they found that no two similar species can occupy the same niche in a habitat at the same time. Different species cannot coexist if competing for that same resource, and the species that most efficiently exploits the resource, has the best adaptations, will drive the other species to extinction if that other species persists and tries to keep using that resource. So whoever has the best adaptations, such as it would be tough if the lion and the tiger were from the same continent and the same habitat, that they would want to eat the same things, so one of them would drive the other to extinction if the other one didn't back away and find a different resource. But luckily one's from Asia, the other one is from Africa. So here's an example that we'll take a look at with these organisms here, that they both want to live right here at this tidal zone. But one species will drive the other away. We'll talk about that one in a bit. And we find in a habitat then that there's resource partitioning, and this reduces the competition by organisms finding their own little micro-habitat to avoid the other species that is similar to themselves. And we see this a lot in these lizards. Anole lizards, A-N-O-L-E, that's what the A stands for. Some will have a micro-habitat up in the branches up here. Some will live on the trunks of the trees. Some will live a little bit lower. Some will occupy the bottoms and the bushes below, or the smaller trees. And then everybody can be happy, right? And nobody will be driven to extinction. And then through that we can study these organisms and see how well over time they become very adapted to their particular environment, such as those that live on the twigs get short little legs that can really grasp those twigs, and those that live down below are better at, with longer legs, and being able to scoot up the trunk. And those that live up in the leaves really match the coloration of those leaves. This is a experiment that they did with some protists called paramecium, two different species of paramecium. Those are one-celled creatures that they grow well individually when you give them what they need, but when you put them together and only give them the one resource, they'll compete for that, and they find that Aurelia always outcompetes the caudatum. So you can watch the caudatum numbers go down over days' time. Again, that was the competitive exclusion principle. So a symbiosis is another type of relationship in a community. It's a close long-term relationship between individuals of different species. They live together, live closely, and then there could be benefits or there could be harm depending on the type of relationship. We'll look at these three types here. Starting with commensalism, this is when two different species live together and only one benefits, but the other species is not harmed. It's kind of more of a neutral situation for the other species. A great example of that I always think of is the sharks. I don't have a picture of it, but sharks have those little fish that kind of attach to them or follow them, and then they'll get scraps of meat as the shark makes a kill. but the shark isn't harmed with these other fish hanging around them. That's a great example of commensalism. But I don't know that the shark is really getting a benefit from them being around. So again, commensalism. It's more neutral for the shark. Here's the southern masked weaver starting to make a nest in the tree. It's an example of a commensal relationship in which one species benefits while the tree is not harmed. Neither benefits nor is harmed. So it's more neutral for the tree. Mutualism is when the different species live with each other and they both get a benefit. There's a lot of examples of this. Even in ourselves, we have bacteria that live within us, and they benefit by getting a nice, warm, moist place to live and the food that we eat, whereas we get benefits from them because they help us digest our food, they can help our immune system, and then they can also create different things like vitamin K, things that we need. That's a great example of mutualism within us. With termites, they have protists that live in their guts, and the termite benefits by the protist being able to digest cellulose. And the protist benefits from a very protective environment inside the termite where they live and a constant food supply. Then there's even another mutualistic benefit where the protists have bacteria in their guts as well that help them digest the cellulose, where the bacteria get a warm place to live, and then the protist gets the benefit of the added help in digestion. Lichen, which includes a fungus and a photosynthetic algae. The algae produces the food through photosynthesis, while the fungus protects the algae from the elements and makes nutrients more available to the algae. So that's another great example of mutualism. One of my favorite examples of mutualism is the birds that live with they'll live with like crocodiles or with grazing animals, and they'll either live on them or near them, and they'll eat the bugs off them, and then the animal gets that benefit that there's somebody taking bugs away from their environment. Or the bird that lives with the crocodiles, and the crocodile opens its mouth and it cleans the leeches off of its teeth, but it never eats the bird. Both of them get a benefit. The bird gets a meal and the crocodile gets a free dentist appointment. So those are some of my favorite mutualistic relationships. Parasitism is also a symbiosis between two different species. However, in this relationship, one organism is harmed while the other is benefited. The one that's harmed is called the host. The one that benefits is called the parasite. And usually the host will get weakened over time by the parasite as it siphons resources off of it. Normally it would need those resources for itself. So the parasite would probably not benefit if it killed its host right away. So many parasites have adaptations to slow down the process so the parasite has time to do its living and to reach reproductive age and make more of its species, more of itself. So tapeworms in pigs, cows, and fish, those are great examples of symbioses. The malaria parasite that lives within mosquitoes, it's actually a protist that lives within mosquitoes and then gets transmitted to humans. That's an example of a parasite, that malaria parasite. There's a diagram if you're interested of the tapeworm life cycle and how that human can actually enter that life cycle if we eat raw or undercooked pork or fish or beef or any kind of meat that is infected with tapeworms. Fortunately, around where we live here in Minnesota, we inspect our meat quite well, so we don't have that problem as badly, and if you just cook it, it would kill the tapeworm and you wouldn't ever have to worry anyway. But tapeworms can live within our intestines and siphon away nutrients from us. They can get so big that they block our intestines, and they can burrow out of our intestines and end up in different places, like in a muscle, in our eye, in our brain, and they kind of make a little cyst around themselves, and then it becomes painful, or if there's a lot of them, can stop that organ from functioning. People have died from tapeworm infection in the brain. So to summarize with these symbiotic reactions, here I do have, I added predation as well, but you get a minus with competition. Both of them are not benefiting, or there's a negative impact on both when there's competition and you're trying to go for a limited resource. That's that competitive exclusion. Predation and parasitism, the host will have the negative effect and the parasite or predator will benefit. Although there is a thought that with the predation that the prey does benefit in that the predator helps control their population and stop the numbers from getting too big, and so that'll stop the prey organisms from wrecking their environment or from disease becoming prominent. Mutualism, both of them get the benefit, like the lichen, and commensalism, one is benefited and then one is neutral, like barnacles attached to a whale. Oh, there's the little birds that live around the grazing animals, eating the insects off of them. Neat interactions. And even the clownfish and the sea anemone is a mutualistic relationship where they get protection by living inside the anemone. And while the clownfish is moving in and out of the anemone, it's helping to aerate the tentacles. An interesting example of parasitism is the cowbird. We actually have those in Minnesota. And there's other birds that do this. They're called parasite birds, where instead of building their own nest and going to all that work and energy, they'll go find another nest, even a different species, and lay their egg there. And then it'll hatch with the other baby birds. The other parents will take care of it, therefore not having to go through the energy of parenting. And as you see, sometimes the parasite bird's offspring is much bigger than the other offspring of the species they laid their eggs in the nest, and so that can be a very negative for the other species, and cause the other baby birds to die with the other big one in there taking all the food. That is a very interesting adaptation. The SciShow, if you watch that Crash Course Biology SciShow on YouTube, they have an interesting video on human parasites. If you're interested in that type of thing, just go to YouTube, search SciShow human parasites, or you can click on the link and go directly to it. So, as you're seeing, I hope, communities are very complex systems with a lot of relationships and a lot of things going on. They're characterized by their structure, the number and size of populations and their interactions, and the dynamics happening, like how the members and their interactions change over time. And understanding community structure and dynamics helps us to minimize impacts on an ecosystem and help to manage ecological communities that we benefit from. All of it is part of ecosystem studies, what an ecologist or a biologist would do, especially a community ecologist. So again, community structure is characterized by species diversity. How many different species are there? By its composition, like what is the dominant species, the most abundant species, or who has the highest biomass? Bio meaning life. So the total weight, there's the predominant species is this starfish, because if we did a mass of all of them, they would occupy the biggest biomass. There's also the keystone species, which we'll talk about in a moment. It's a very important species in the community, and then it's also characterized by changes over time, such as what the different types of life look like at one point, and then 50 years later, what does it look like? That's called succession. Moving on with characteristics of communities. Biodiversity is the number of different species in a particular area and their relative abundance, which we've stated before. This could be just looking at a habitat by itself or the whole biome, such as like a taiga or a tropical rainforest, or the entire biosphere. Species richness is the term used to describe the number of species living in a habitat or other unit, and this will vary across the globe. And ecologists have struggled to understand the determinants of biodiversity, but they have realized that species richness is related to latitude. I have a picture of that coming up, and that the greatest species richness will occur near the equator, like in the tropical regions, and the lowest richness will be at the poles, probably as you suspect, like in Antarctica or the Arctic, where it's very cold. Island biogeography attempts to explain the great species richness found in isolated islands, and has found relationships between species richness, island size, and distance from the mainland, such as the Galapagos Islands, 600 miles off of the coast of South America, which we have talked about before. So the relative species abundance is the number of individuals in a species relative to the total number of individuals in all species within a system. And the foundation species often have the highest relative abundance of all the species in an area or in a unit. So here's that picture I promised you showing species richness and how it's related to latitude. The darker the color, that's your greater species richness. So we're looking at our equator right around in here, and so the tip of South America there definitely has a greater species richness than, say, up here in Canada, or even in Minnesota right here. If you have greater diversity, what we found is that there's greater stability. So the greater the biodiversity of an area, the more stable that ecosystem is. In fact, they've done tests of this in Minnesota, just more north of the Twin Cities. They did some testing where they had different areas. Some areas were very old and had a great species richness, and some were farmland that had been cleared and then allowed to regrow, but at different times, not too long for some and a little longer for others. And then a drought happened, and then that kind of tested everything there. It was awesome that they were able to do this test, and they had these plots of land set up. And they did find that the older land with the greater species richness, the greater biodiversity, recovered much faster from the drought than the cleared farmland. Especially recently cleared farmland did not recover that well at all. But it makes a habitat more resilient in the face of environmental changes. That's why it's so important that we study this stuff and we preserve species diversity, biodiversity here on Earth, because it makes things so much more stable. And maybe that's something that humans don't realize, or most humans don't realize. It's kind of all about me, what can I get out of everything society, but we need to realize that our living organisms out there provide what are called ecosystem services for us, and we can't live without them, and we need to preserve them and preserve biodiversity, because if anything happens, biodiversity will help us recover much quicker. Here's the impact of reduced biodiversity. So this population here, this habitat is called a monoculture. It's been cleared, and basically it's one thing. There might be a tree every now and then, but it's basically one thing that will not recover very quickly. There's not enough biodiversity. Over here in Old Field has a lot of diversity, different trees, bushes, plants, and will recover much better. So foundation species, we've briefly mentioned this. The foundation species are considered the base or bedrock of a community. It has the greatest influence on the overall community structure. They're often the primary producers, those that can do photosynthesis, and they're typically an abundant organism. So an example might be kelp, or a species of brown algae. That's a foundation species that forms the basis of the kelp forests off the coast of California. Foundation species may physically modify the environment to produce and maintain habitats that benefit other organisms, like the kelp described above, or the tree species found in a forest, or the photosynthetic corals of the coral reef. They actually make the coral that other organisms can live in and do photosynthesis. And the coral is very protective of waves and ocean currents, like we see in the picture here. The keystone species, that's the one whose presence has inordinate influence in maintaining the prevalence of various species in an ecosystem, its structure and biodiversity. Like the intertidal sea star. Next slide will show that example, or the banded tetra. So they've done multiple studies on this type of sea star. It's a keystone species in the northwestern portion of the United States, and studies have shown when this organism is removed from the communities, mussel populations will just blow up and increase. Those are their natural prey. But when the sea star is there, they help to keep those mussel populations under control, therefore allowing other species in and more biodiversity. So this is an important keystone species that must be protected. Has an influential ecological role. It exerts that important regulating effect on other species, increasing biodiversity. So there's a graph to show how it helps to control those mussels. Or the sea otter, a keystone species, predator of the North Pacific. The orca whale, in a study, started eating them more, and they found when more of those otters were eaten, the sea urchin population increased, which then decreased the producer population, which is not good. Somebody has to keep these guys, these urchins, under control. The beaver, a keystone species of the Northeast and West. Their dams will transform flowing streams into ponds, creating many new habitats, therefore increasing biodiversity. Something that decreases biodiversity is invasive species. These are non-native organisms that, when introduced to an area out of its native range, alter the community that they invade. Basically, these organisms are brought there. They did not evolve there, so they lack natural predators and they lack control. And this will increase competition with the native species who do have predators and controls. And so guess who's going to win? It's the invasive species. They take over, reduce the biodiversity and the species richness, and can basically alter and wreck a whole habitat. So here's some examples of non-native species, sometimes also called exotic species and often called invasive species, such as the African honeybee, which was brought to South America and let go, and now ever since has been moving north towards the United States, and they will hurt the regular honeybee. They're much more aggressive. Unfortunately, they're not as great at pollinating as the regular honeybees, so their presence is not a benefit to anybody, but they do not belong here. The gypsy moth down here is another one that we look for in Minnesota. In fact, the DNR traps them to count their numbers every year to see how their numbers are growing. Zebra mussels in the Great Lakes just cover everything. And another plant called purple loosestrife. There's the zebra mussels. Here they are covering a shopping cart completely after just 2 months. They do a lot of damage. Well, their numbers are growing and they're even spreading, not just in the Great Lakes anymore, but further south in the United States. And all of these invasive species have economic damage where it costs money as well for taxpayers to try to get rid of them. Check out this area where we see 1968, and then purple loosestrife takes over. First we had a lot of biodiversity, now it's all purple loosestrife. So let's look at changes in community structure and composition over time. Often following environmental disturbances like volcanoes, earthquakes, storms, fires, and climate damage can change the equilibrium state of the community. This is called succession. It describes the sequential appearance or disappearance of species in a community over time after a severe disturbance. So we'll start with primary succession, such as, let's say, a volcano erupted or some sort of fire happened that totally caused damage. It wiped out what communities were there. So we start with primary succession. This is when the newly exposed or newly formed rock is colonized by the first living organisms that are there, that are able to do it. Secondary succession is the part of an ecosystem is disturbed and then the remnants of the previous community remain. So then it'll start growing after that. And in both cases there's a sequential change in species until a more or less permanent community develops and maybe finally we can reach our equilibrium state again. So here's an example of primary succession on the island of Maui in Hawaii in the lava. These succulent plants are what are called pioneer species. So again, the ecological succession is a sequence of community changes. Transition in species composition over time could take years, decades, sometimes longer, and usually after a disturbance like the eruption on Mount St. Helens. You can see some primary species starting to take over here. So primary succession will begin with virtually this lifeless area without soil, but then we get bacteria, lichens and moss, grasses, shrubs, and finally trees. It goes through that kind of succession. So it takes a long time to bring things back, and you have to have something first and then the next. Each kind of lays the groundwork for the following species to be able to live there. So weathering and other natural forces break down the rock enough for the establishment of hardy species like lichens and some plants known as pioneer species, like this plant right there, or that one there. Secondary succession. This is an existing community is cleared, but the base soil is still intact. Could be after a fire. That's a great classic example. In oak and hickory forests cleared by wildfire, and although the community has been dramatically altered, we still have our soil ecosystem. to provide a foundation for rapid colonization. Pioneer species, lichens and moss. We get these organisms like grasses, which will compete well in high sunlight because there's no trees or bushes yet. Then finally, bushes and small trees, more shade-tolerant species. And then the climax forest. It's kind of the equilibrium, the end-all beat-all, where we have our shade-tolerant species and our stable community. So what causes succession? Tolerance. Early species are weedy, are selected, have a lot of offspring. They tolerate those harsh conditions that are there through facilitation and inhibition. And early species help to facilitate habitat changes. They lay the groundwork so others can exist, like changing soil pH and fertility of the soil and light levels, and then allows other species to outcompete. And finally, our climax forest is the plant community dominated by trees, an equilibrium state, similar to before the disturbance and representing the final stage of natural succession for specific locations. It'll have a stable plant community and remains essentially unchanged in species composition as long as the site is undisturbed. Some tree species you may find in a climax forest include birch, beech, maple, hemlock, oak, hickory, and pine. Kind of reminds me of some of our Minnesota communities. It's a taiga and a temperate deciduous forest there. Beautiful fall colors. But sometimes disturbances are often necessary for community development and survival because like burning will release nutrients that are tied up in some of the dead stuff and will then eventually create more biodiversity, such as fire climax forests. Before the burning happens and then after the burn, it rejuvenates the community. And then big trees that live in those areas may have adaptations to survive these fire climax forests, like Jack pine. They have seeds that open up when a fire occurs. That helps to spread their seeds, so it's expected every now and then there should be a forest fire to burn all the kindling and stuff below and release those nutrients, release the seeds of some of these species who have the adaptations for surviving the fire. But sometimes, well, humans, we don't realize this, that places are meant to have fires, and they build in a fire climax zone and then end up having forest fires. They will prevent fires, which then builds up more kindling, and so when the fires actually occur, then whoosh, they get a bigger fire than what would normally occur. So here's a diagram of secondary succession in an oak and hickory forest. Over time, our pioneer species to begin with, then the intermediate species, and finally the climax community. All right, as usual, as we end our chapter here, I recommend taking a look at the end of the chapter questions. Remember, we divided this chapter up, so some of these questions, the first part belongs to Chapter 19A, the beginning, the first 3 sections, and then the last questions belong to the section we just finished now. So take a look at those. Let me know if you have any questions, and we'll see you next time.